welcome to Criminologist et al. Convene. Today it's me, Jen, again, and we are joined by Professor Geniece Monde from Wingate University, Wingate, and that's in North Carolina. So we've got somebody from the States again on a call, which is great, and it's near Charlotte in North Carolina. So she's joining us today to talk about some of the amazing work that she's done, and has recently just released a book as well. This is Our Freedom: Motherhood in the Shadow of an American Prison System. I think I got it right first. Of American prison systems. Without further ado, I guess I'll just ask a few questions around some of the work that she's currently done, and just run through the usual questions that we have. So, just for a bit of clarification, she's a US-based sociologist / criminologist, and a lot of her work focuses on formerly incarcerated women. So I'll just hand over to you with the first question. So how did you get involved in your current career and your subject matter specifically?
So like a lot of other folks, I kind of stumbled into my research. I entered graduate school thinking I would study education. And then by my third year, I found myself sitting in a meeting with law enforcement officers, community activists, and just regular folk who are frustrated with crime. And that really took me on a detour thinking about issues of crime within urban communities and contexts. And after that project, which was basically an evaluation of a crime initiative, which became my master's thesis, I really wanted to understand how people who were engaged in criminal activity understood the issues that impacted them. And so this then took me towards my current line of research, focusing on women who had been incarcerated, and looking at their experiences navigating life after incarceration, looking at women from all walks of life, some who had difficult childhoods and some who didn't, how they ended up in the places where they were. And I met women when they were trying to get jobs or trying to gain custody of their children. And, it really speaks to the idea that sometimes we start research in one place, and if we're open, we can find ourselves ending up in a completely different research topic area.
Yeah, that's really true. It's always that notion of the rabbit hole, and one thing
Exactly.
I was warned about. I don't want to say warned, because that's kind of gives it a bit of a negative connotation. But one of the things I was advised about when I started my PhD was, you're going to go down rabbit holes and you're going to find out things, and you're going to want to, take different paths. But obviously, you have to kind of stay as directed as you can. But it is really not easy. But it's things are so intriguing that you do want to kind of divert and divest into other little things. So, it's interesting to know that obviously your career's allowed you, or you've allowed yourself within your career to kind of explore different things, but yet still stay true to kind of what it is you're interested in. So that just brings me to my next question, specifically around obviously your most recent book. So can you give the listeners and the viewers a bit of a summary about your book and some of like additional work that you've potentially done?
Exactly. I'd be happy to. So this book came out this summer in June, so it is a new book, and it chronicles the experiences of the women I interviewed. I interviewed 70 women. Most of those women were in New York City, and then about half of them were in the state of Massachusetts, and like two of those women were in what I call in the book New England City. I anonymatized the city because some of the details I give are so specific that it would be really easy for the readers to figure out the actual organization, and I do want it to keep some anonymity. So another city in New England, which is north of the United States. And all of the women had been incarcerated. All of the women were mothers. That is what they all shared in common. About Most of the women were African American. Then about 20 or so of those women were white. And then the remainder were either identified as being Latina or mixed race. And their experiences navigating life after prison centered primarily around trying to gain custody of their children, trying to rebuild those relationships. And a lot of that was made difficult by the hurdles that they had to jump through, trying to get a job, trying to rebuild relationships, or just trying to avoid the stigma that many people had of them, of being quote unquote bad mothers, of being viewed as not worthy of being a mother. And so in the book, what I want readers to be able to see and to read is the perspective that women have. They're aware of how they're perceived. They understand that what they've done in many cases were mistakes, but in other instances, they do provide pretty nuanced interpretations of the failings of the criminal justice system. So there are instances in which people were defending themselves and that was not acknowledged. So instead of receiving treatment or protection from someone who was harming them, they were arrested. And so they also help to expose some of the limitations of the criminal justice system and some of the flaws, quite frankly, that people have been focusing on time and time again in the American prison system. And we see it from the perspective of people who have had these negative encounters. And so my goal in writing this book was not to give these women a voice because I firmly believe that they already had a voice, but really to shine a light on their perspectives that are often ignored by society in the United States.
Yeah, this is a really interesting take. So we recently had in one of our previous episodes somebody it's actually Angela Kerwin. She wrote a book specifically about prisons and kind of wanting to do kind of something similar to you in shining the light on people's perspectives, specifically around UK prisons. And it's interesting to see, even though obviously the US and the UK have got their similarities and their differences. It's interesting to see the concept of failings within systems and the state for people that have been incarcerated. But yeah, that was just an interesting point that you made. So in obviously all that work that the research that you've conducted, obviously there's elements of like welfare, there must have been things that you heard that were very difficult, and this isn't a question that I've actually posed, so I apologize if I'm being a bit blindsiding you. But I'm just wondering, like, how did you kind of manage your welfare and, ensure that the welfare of the women that you interviewed were, maintained?
This is one of the things, and I wrote about this in like my appendix section of the book that I wasn't prepared for when I entered the fields as a pretty young graduate student, knowing how to navigate those questions. So there's a lot of abuse history, and this is pretty firmly across the board for people who've been incarcerated. You're going to have a lot higher rates of abuse of all forms among that population than among people who've never been incarcerated. And I wasn't prepared for the detail with which women would tell me the levels of abuse they experienced. One of the things that I picked up on early on was to let women speak. I usually follow up with questions. Tell me more about, that job or why you lost that job. But when it came to issues of abuse, I didn't follow up because what I say in my at the end of my book, I didn't want to re-traumatize women. These are women who have limited resources. Many of them, very few discuss therapy, and I imagine many of them had limited resources to get professional therapy. And so I didn't want this interview to re-traumatize them such that after the interview, they were brought into an emotional place and had nothing to do with those feelings. So I let women speak, and when they were finished speaking, I acknowledged it. I didn't just, bluntly move on, but I didn't say, tell me more about this or tell me more about that, because I felt that I didn't want to make them go into an emotional place that they weren't capable of handling. For me, I was also unprepared for how it would impact me. I had a very different experience. I didn't grow up in a lot of the context in the New York City environment, similar neighborhoods I was familiar with, but I had a very different home life experience than many of these women. So I just figured, well, I'm an outsider. But I remember I would, some of my interviews I conducted in the middle of the summer, and I would leave the interview site, which was a transition home for women returning from prison, and I would get on the train and come home because it happened to be in the same relatively close to where my parents were living. I lived in the Boston area, but I was doing them in New York City. I'd go to my parents' home and I would just like crash on the bed, and my mom would be like, "What's wrong?" And I was just emotionally drained. Um, one of the things I remember doing to cope was there was a young woman, and her narrative is actually the very first narrative in the book. The name that I give her is Aaliyah, and she had really significant trauma. And we met a couple of times, and she had a newborn baby. And so I left that day and I went to a shopping area and I bought a whole bunch of baby clothes. Um, Little girl, she had a little girl baby clothes, and I brought them to the center. And I knew it wouldn't go directly to her because they needed to, but it was an act of joy that I enjoyed doing and I knew would benefit. Um, the woman there, and I felt, it was improper for me to give them to her directly as a researcher. And so that was one way for me to think about ways that I could bring joy, since I was really just asking questions. But in retrospect, I do think that researchers need to be more prepared for the emotional and psychological impact of those kinds of interviews, because we can downplay it, but a lot of these narratives are really, really quite heavy, and you want to be sensitive to the people you're interviewing, but you also want to take care of who you are as a researcher in the fields as well.
Yeah, that's it's true. And like you said, it's one of those unexpected things that you don't realize. I know from my own personal experience and other people I've spoke to within academia, you kind of don't realize how, profound some of these stories can potentially be, or what impact they have. It doesn't matter how much, ethics you write or how much you predict what could potentially happen. It isn't until you obviously go through the motions that you realize how much of an impact it can have on yourself and participants or contributors to your research. So you've obviously already given a little bit of advice around kind of how to manage like welfare and mental health. But do you have any other additional advice that you would give to someone that potentially wants to go into the world of sociology or criminology, or into kind of your research area?
Absolutely. First, I would definitely say be open to the opportunities available to you. What I mentioned about being at this meeting one summer with, law enforcement community activists, that came about because a faculty member at a different university, other than the one that I was working, getting my PhD from, sent me an email because they wanted research assistance. And this was not my area of research, but I was open, and that took me down a trajectory that I didn't expect. Once you're in that line of research, one of the things that I would definitely advise, and this is really true if you're working with people or conducting research with groups that are marginalized, be very careful of sensationalizing their experiences, because it can be really tempting, because that's often what the general public wants to read about, people who are downtrodden and broken. You want to make sure the humanity of people is always prioritized. Your goal as a researcher is to identify themes and concepts that speak to broader issues in society, not to, sensationalize a person, just so you can become really prominent in the fields, and you can really focus on the humanity of people and still further your career. Because I think that's a trap that can sometimes trip people up. And so I was, even in writing the book, I'd write a sentence and think, I don't know that that comes across well. Or I would, my first draft, I remember I had a detail about someone, and this person was pretty vocal. And they had actually eventually made a documentary, and I realized someone might be able to figure out who this person is. And I had promised the woman anonymity. And so taking things out, even if it doesn't read as nicely, even if you have to put a footnote that says, I took out a detail because I wanted to protect the anonymity, always prioritize the interests of the people you're interviewing, and not your own um, fame or notoriety. Because once you do that, you are not serving not just the people you're interviewing, but the broader goal of academic research.
That's a really important point, research integrity and just personal integrity as well. That I definitely think will be really useful for kind of the listeners or the viewers, and myself as well. So just finally, if we wanted to reach out to you or wanted to contact you, how can we get in touch?
Absolutely. So I am active on Twitter, not as active as some people. My handle is Dr. Geniece, so DrGeniece. And if you send me a direct message, I will absolutely respond and be happy to connect.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for taking the time out to talk with us. And that kind of brings us to the end of another Criminologist et al. Convene. If you are interested in talking to us about some work that you've done or that you've got ongoing, reach out to us at the Crimi Talk, and we're still here, and we will continue to post more videos and more content for you. Thank you.